Recording started? People in?
Yes, it has started.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Sylvia Paris-Drummond, and I'm the CEO at the Delmore Buddy Day Learning Institute. It's my honor and privilege and pleasure to be here with everyone today, and I would like to begin appropriately with a land and people acknowledgement. As we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that while we are not gathered together in person, we are connecting and learning together virtually in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This territory is covered by the treaties of peace and friendship that were signed by the Mi'kmaq and Wolaski people with the British Crown in 1726. These territories did not surrender or transfer land to the British, but rather recognized Mi'kmaq title and set the rules for what was meant to be a long-standing relationship between nations. Initially, preventing both war and preventing interference with indigenous rights to hunting, fishing, and agriculture, and facilitating trade. We are all treaty people, and as such, have responsibilities to each other and this land. This territory is also the birthplace of African heritage and culture in this land that we now call Canada. Following forcible displacement of people of African descent and the out-migration of Black loyalists from the United States, African Nova Scotians have shared these lands for over 400 years in Nova Scotia, and over 50 strong and resourceful African Nova Scotian communities exist here today. This is important to acknowledge, especially as we engage in deep learning throughout this series that you're beginning with today. I'm proud to let you know that this series is part of what we are able to deliver through a project called Together We Rise. Together We Rise is a 3-year initiative launched to address the systemic barriers that Black women face in leadership. We have been supported in the execution of this through funding from multiple sources, with the key funding being from the Nova Scotia Advisory Council on the Status of Women. This project builds on the research from Senator Wanda Thomas Bernard, who's here with us today, known under the research title Concrete Ceilings. It explored the lived experiences of Black women in Canada's public sector. We're honored to have Senator Bernard as our moderator, as the first African Nova Scotian woman appointed to the Senate. She brings decades of leadership in racial justice, equity, and mental health, and continues to be a powerful advocate for African Canadian communities and a generous mentor to many. Senator Bernard.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. And thank you to the team who has organized this. And a special welcome to our featured speakers today. I will introduce them, and then I will introduce the conversation series. I'll start with Dr. Barbara Hamilton-Hinch, who is a Dalhousie University professor and equity leader whose research explores how racism impacts health in African Nova Scotian communities, with a focus on HIV testing, prostate cancer, and institutional racism. And we have 2 students with us today. Summer Borden is a student services advisor and African Canadian support worker at the Nova Scotia Community College Pictou campus. With 4 years of experience as an African Nova Scotian student support worker, a role she will return to in September, Summer also serves at a board on the community level and is currently pursuing her Bachelor of Education degree at Acadia University. And we have Coretta Beals, who's a dedicated student also in Acadia's Africentric Bachelor of Education cohort at Acadia University. Coretta has a background in social justice and community studies, and she strives to inspire others and make a positive impact in her community. Now, let me introduce the series, Emancipate Your Mind, a conversation series. We will be hosting these lunch and learns for the next 4 Tuesdays leading up to Emancipation Day. I'll tell you, I first learned about Emancipation Day as an undergraduate student. So, Coretta and Summer, I was where you are a few decades ago. And it was during a time when I was also becoming very deeply engaged in the civil rights movement. Since then, Emancipation Day has become more than a historical marker for me. I see Emancipation Day as a day of remembrance, a day of reflection, and a day of responsibility. It is a time to honor our ancestors, their resilience, their resistance, and their hard work. It is also a time to honor those who did not survive the brutalities of enslavement. Recognizing Emancipation Day invites us to reflect on the full scope of our history and how that history continues to shape the anti-Black racism that we're still confronting every single day. Although emancipation was declared in Canada in 1834, the institution of enslavement laid the foundation for systemic anti-Black racism that has been allowed to persist in Canada and around the world. Marking this day is not only about healing from the trauma of a violent past, but it's also about committing to the systemic changes needed to ensure a just and equitable future for generations to come. Welcome to all of you to this conversation series. So as I said, today we begin this series by centering ourselves. And the focus for today is Africentricity in academia. This conversation is about reclaiming space. It's about honoring our truths. And it's also about imagine, if you will, what true emancipation looks like. Not just in our history, but in our present, and more importantly, I believe, in our future. So we'll get to the questions, but let me say to the audience before we start that there will be an opportunity for audience Q&A. So as you're listening and witnessing this conversation with Dr. Barb Hamilton-Hinch, Coretta, and Summer, I invite you to think about questions you may want to ask these 3 esteemed guests yourselves when you're invited to do so. So Dr. Barb Hamilton-Hinch, the first question is going to you. To start us off, can you tell us, what does Emancipation Day mean to you? And if you could reflect on that both personally and professionally, please.
Thank you for that question. And it's something around this time of year that we often think about. And personally, it's a recognition, and Senator Bernard shared some of her thoughts, which are similar to how I see it personally, a recognition of the strength of my ancestors. My research lab, I call it On These Shoulders, because I recognize that everything I do, everything that I am, is because of the sacrifices of my ancestors. And the fact that they were enslaved and the challenges they endured, yet they survived, and that their spirit lives in us. And the fact that we're able to be here, attend the post-secondary institutions, teach at post-secondary institutions is a testament of their sacrifice. And then professionally, it provides them with the opportunity to educate others about the history of people of African descent. It's amazing how people still don't know or don't recognize that slavery existed in Canada, that slavery existed in Nova Scotia. And as people of African descent, we continue to fight for equality. And I've joked with Senator Bernard before, when I remember going to legislation and pushing for August 1st as Emancipation Day. And recently I said, wouldn't it be fantastic if in that movement we pushed for African Heritage Month in Nova Scotia to be in August, recognizing where we are currently in terms of it's in February. But I think as people of African descent, it's important for us to elevate, celebrate, and recognize who we are and our strength, no matter what day. As somebody says, 365 days a year, we are Black, we are people of African descent. But on August 1st, and leading up to August 1st, it's important to reflect and take time and think about where we were, where we are, and where we're going.
Dr. Hamilton-Hinch, let me stay with you for a moment. And I wonder if professionally you could speak to this from your position as part of the senior leadership team at Dalhousie. And I realize I didn't reference that when I did the very abbreviated bio of you, but I want, for the record, to have that, but also for you to talk for a moment about how you leverage work around Emancipation Day through that leadership voice.
Yes, it's really important, sitting as the Assistant Vice Provost of Equity and Inclusion, that we recognize, lift, and celebrate the challenges of individuals and populations that have been marginalized. And at Dalhousie University, we definitely recognize the people of African Nova Scotians, as well as our Indigenous, our Mi'kmaq community, and their experiences of oppression, racism, and discrimination in Canada, and how, to a degree, Dalhousie University have benefited off of the lives, and how Indigenous and African Nova Scotian people were not part of Dalhousie. And although we talk about Dalhousie being founded in 1818, it wasn't a place where people of African descent with African Nova Scotians were welcomed and able to come, teach, be a student, be a part of the leadership. And so, sitting in the position that I sit in, it's important for me to make sure our university and our leaders stay accountable to African Nova Scotians and to people of African descent, and recognize that history and celebrate and acknowledge the sacrifices and contributions that people of African descent have made in Nova Scotia. And I'm very proud of the fact that at Dalhousie, when we do any of our openings and our celebrations, as we do the land acknowledgement for our Indigenous people, we recognize the contributions and the distinctiveness of African Nova Scotians. And at Dalhousie University, we continue to increase the number of programs and pathways for African Nova Scotians and other students of African descent. And we need to continue to push that. We need to continue to keep our senior leaders aware of the ongoing discrimination that exists. And I often tell folks that although I'm a professor and I've been also in terms of a DPMG, so I was the Black Student Advisor, and now sitting as senior leadership, I still experience challenges of racism. I still face challenges of not always feeling welcomed and included at the table. And so one of my jobs and responsibilities, and I've learned this from other leaders who've gone before me, such as Senator Bernard sitting at Dalhousie, because it's not easy being the only. And for a long period of time, Senator Bernard, as many of you know, would have been that only African Nova Scotian tenured professor, and also the only African Nova Scotian director at that time. And so there's a sense of making sure that the door that was opened for me by people such as Senator Bernard, that I'm able to open that door for others, and to make sure that we stay part of senior leaders and that our voices are heard, and that our experience is not forgotten.
Thank you so much. And thank you for that interview yesterday with Jeff Douglas on Main Street. And I'll ask our wonderful team to pop a link to that in the chat so that if anyone who's on the call missed it, they'll be able to tune in.
Thank you.
Let's go now to current post-secondary students who are studying education at Acadia University. Coretta and Summer, for each of you, can you tell us, what does Emancipation Day mean to you personally? Who'd like to start? Summer?
Sure,
You have the biggest smile. Go ahead.
Sure. You both have said that so well. So kind of just to echo what the both of you have said, to me, it's about remembering our ancestors, right, and their strength. It reminds me of that incredible resilience, right, of the Black loyalists, the Jamaican Maroons, right, who came to Nova Scotia to seek their freedom. And for me, it's very humbling, again, from being, enslaved in that fight and building their life here against all odds to fight for that liberation. That's why we're all here today, right? It's because those people who came before us. It's also for me about the pride, right? The pride in who I am today. As Emancipation Day, to me, celebrates our culture and those contributions of us as African Nova Scotians. And it's just a moment to feel proud, of our communities, of our music and our stories and our culture and just everything that makes us who we are as people, as African Nova Scotians. And it's just about that again, looking at the past, but then also being thankful about where we are now. And of course, we have still a long ways to go, but just knowing how far that we've come motivates me to learn more, to speak up for those, injustices, and work towards just a more equitable future for all of us. And for me, it's just a very important day as well. Because again, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for those people who came before me, as we stand on our ancestors' shoulders. So just acknowledging our ancestors and acknowledging those people who have come before us and giving thanks. For me, yeah, it's very important for sure.
Thank you so much. Coretta, hard to have the last word on this one, but
yeah, I don't want to repeat
from your
too much.
voice.
But I would say, to me personally, Emancipation Day, it's a reminder, like Summer said, of the resilience and strength of my ancestors, a day to reflect on their journey and feeling that personal call to action to continue challenging systemic racism and inequality. As a future educator, I see it as my responsibility to continue to challenge biases, teach our learners about our history, and empower this next generation to be agents of change. Emancipation Day reminds me that I'm deeply connected to a powerful lineage of resilience. This day emphasizes the importance of remembering where I come from, our history, and the importance of our community.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's go back to Dr. Hamilton-Hinch. What parallels do you see between the historical fight for emancipation from enslavement and the current struggle for intellectual freedom, what we call emancipating our minds?
Well, it's interesting when I think about emancipating our minds, the first thing that comes to my mind is Bob Marley's song, all right? And many of us in North America received a colonial education where the lived experience of people of African descent was erased from the curriculum, from in front of the classroom, and very excited to see these two beautiful young women going into education because we know that it's important for our children to get a proper education, to develop a stronger sense of who they are. And that's connected to emancipating our minds. That when I went to school, my history that I was taught started with me as a Black person being enslaved, and not about my ancestors being kings and queens and scientists and orators and doctors and judges and philosophers and healers. And even when I think about the fact that it's in Mother Africa where civilization began and where so many things have been copied by us, by people of African descent. And And as the expression goes, when we know better, we do better. And those who know must teach. And so there's that calling that once those of us who have learned, who have come to understand our history, to have come to appreciate who we are as people of African descent, we have another sense of responsibility. And we've seen the evolution of intellectuals. And I don't just mean academic scholars, but individuals who have taken the time to also learn about who they are and who we are as people of African descent. And I credit Cultural Awareness Youth Group of Nova Scotia, which was an organization that existed in the 80s and helped so many of us that are African Nova Scotian youth to learn about who we are as people of African descent, to embrace our identity. Coming from the communities of Beachville and Cherry Brook, that wasn't something that I was taught until I connected to the Cultural Awareness Youth Group that taught me about the rich contributions of Black people. And that sense of pride became instilled in me at an early age and made it my responsibility to then start teaching. And even as I've had opportunities to travel and take folks to Mother Africa and different countries, and I'm fortunate that I'll be heading that way again July 18th. And when I think about Emancipation Day, this will be my second year being able to spend that day on the continent, taking the walk, the last bath, and going to the dungeons and sitting at midnight when they call the spirits back home to those dungeons. And so emancipating our minds, meaning taking some of that responsibility to teach myself and to teach others, and to acknowledge again that strength and that resilience, and to fight against the structural, institutional, and systemic and environmental racism that has impacted us as people of African descent, and to elevate the Black brilliance that is part of our DNA. And it's important to make sure that very young, not just when you start school, but very young, our children are taught to love who they are, to love their hair, to love their skin. And it may surprise some people that in some of the research that I've been connected to with the Early Childhood Center at Mount St. Vincent University and working with early childhood educators, as early as the age of 3, once kids start daycare, they begin to learn there's a difference. That our children at the age of 3 in daycare are treated differently because of their color of their skin. So we shouldn't wait and can't wait until kids start school to begin to speak truth into them. But we need to do that as early as possible. When the babe is being formed in the belly, hearing you talk about some of the poetry books and writings that you want to do, Senator Bernard. That's why it's so important to read to our babies early when they're in vitro. So they begin to already hear those voices of brilliance, of intelligence, of strength. So it's never too early to emancipate our minds and to correct the harms that have been done through our colonial education, both in public school and post-secondary institutions.
I'm hearing the words resilience, responsibility, accountability, pride, loving who you are. It's all part of emancipating our minds. And so today we have 2 aspiring teachers with us. So when you think about emancipate your mind, what does it mean to you when you think about that in the context of teaching, in the context of being in academic spaces? We'll start with you this time, Coretta.
Right. I see those connections in our educational journey when it comes to recognizing whose voices are praised and whose are silenced in our textbooks and curriculum. For me, it's more than just our own individual mental blocks. It's being aware of the way that colonial oppression still affects how we think and learn today. To emancipate my mind in today's academic space, I have to be willing to ask those tough questions, not just accepting what's taught, but digging deeper, looking at different viewpoints and questioning why certain stories are told and others aren't, especially here in Nova Scotia. Understanding our history means looking at it from all angles and perspectives, including those experiences and the history of African Nova Scotians. For example, if a course only has a single viewpoint on a complex issue or topic, emancipating my mind means looking for those diverse perspectives, engaging with different theories, and forming my own understanding. It means that I'm not just taking notes and digging deeper into the material. I'm not just taking notes, but digging deeper into the material and connecting it to my own experiences. Emancipating my mind means thinking for myself. With so much information out there, it's easy to believe every and anything you see. So emancipating my mind means learning how to figure out what's true, how to spot bias, how to form my own opinions. It's about being brave enough to speak up, about having the confidence to share my ideas and challenge Eurocentric colonial systems and perspectives. It's not just learning, but actively participating in my own education and putting in the effort in shaping the academic space around me as well.
Wow, wow, wow. Awesome. Awesome. I call that positive disruption, challenging the status quo. What do you have to say on this, Summer?
Well, I think both have kind of covered everything. But yeah, like when I think about emancipating my mind in kind of that academic sense, it's not just about getting, that degree or that highest level of education, right? It's about developing those critical thinking skills, right? Being resilient and truly becoming an active and an independent thinker. So again, like not just memorizing those facts, that you're being taught. It's about owning my own learning journey, right? In my own educational experience, asking questions, why does it matter? Being curious about everything, right? So instead of just taking those notes or listening to what, your professor, your teacher's telling you, or what's in the textbook, right? It's about digging deeper, as Coretta was saying. So again, like if you're learning about, a historical event or, anything like that, it's about kind of looking up different sources, considering those biases and asking, are there other perspectives on this? Why did things unfold this way? And what are the alternatives? So again, it's kind of about more so being a detective and not just a recorder. I think too, it's also about embracing those mistakes as learning opportunities, right? Not feeling defeated. We're so often focused on getting those, perfect scores or, sometimes we shy away from challenging ourselves, right? Or we're told, you can only do this, or, you know what I mean? You're only at this level right now. So it's about trying new approaches and it's about getting comfortable with being uncomfortable at times. So again, seeing those errors and those mistakes and using them as stepping stones to help improve. And it empowers us, not to just consume that knowledge, like I said, but also to create it and challenge it, and owning my own education. And sometimes too, there's also that connection when it comes to connecting, those dots in different subjects. So, oftentimes we say, oh, math's just math or history's just history. But sometimes we can see how these different areas can intersect with each other. Which again makes our learning, I think, just more richer. Yeah.
I think you've really led nicely into the next theme I wanted to explore. And I think you've already answered some of this, so I'm going to jump around a bit. So it's really, you're talking about centering ourselves in the academy. And, we've set the stage for emancipating our mind, but in setting the stage, you've really highlighted how important it is for us to center ourselves. And that's our theme today, centering ourselves, Africentricity in academia. In academic and public institutions, Black women continue to face systemic barriers, and Dr. Hamilton-Hinch talked a bit about this, that really limit their advancement and visibility. These barriers, what we call concrete ceilings. Listen, in the feminist movement, we were taught to break through the glass ceiling. And guess what? We broke through the glass ceiling.
Yep.
We found concrete. And so thinking about those concrete ceilings that are reinforced, the steel beams and the concrete ceilings, it's the racism and the sexism. So when we talk about centering ourselves, our voices, our histories, and our leadership, it's not just a personal act of resilience. It's a collective strategy for transformation. When we center ourselves, we create space to uplift others and to reshape the institutions around us. So I wanted to ask a question around that as we explore what it means to center ourselves in academic spaces and how this can serve as a foundation for liberation, for leadership, and for transformational change that will last.
Mhm.
So I want to ask the question, what would it look like? And this is for each of you. What would it look like for your university or your school when you become a teacher to center Black students in real everyday ways? And not just on those special events,
Mhm.
like Emancipation Day, but all the time. Black History, 365 days of the year. What would it
Exactly.
make? What would it mean to center our reality in those spaces? Summer, let's start with you on this.
Sure. So when I think about centering myself, it actually makes me think about the cohort that we're in, and how it's very, again, Afrocentric. So just being around my people, right? Walking into my classrooms and seeing people who look like me, seeing that representation. Again, it's finding my solid ground and that inner peace. Even when, maybe I feel a little bit shaky or things aren't, you know what I mean? Maybe making me feel comfortable. It's also connecting to Ubuntu, right? Which is I am because we are, because you are, right? And again, that Afrocentricity. So it's more than just that personal thing, but it's about my identity and my community and those connections that I have and who I am. It's about affirming, again, my Black identity. So in classes where, our history isn't taught, or where maybe we feel like we're othered, centering myself means kind of remembering the strength of my ancestors and the brilliance of my culture, my people. It's reminding me that my unique perspective and my story matters, right? My voice matters. So sometimes, and I think we can all speak to this, at times we're in predominantly white classrooms. But I find, when I think about those people who come before me, my ancestors, or I think about, different trailblazers like Maya Angelou, you know, that kind of helps center me in who I am. And just giving me, again, that resilience that I need to, again, kind of push through when things, maybe aren't so comfortable. Again, it's drawing strength from my community as well. So I find centering myself also happens when I'm around my people, my family, my friends, my cohort classmates, even in groups like this, where there's almost that kind of unspoken understanding that we already have that connection, right? That doesn't even need to be said. It's just already there. We have that shared history. And it's just a collecting kind of uplifting feeling that we all have when we come together. And I just find kind of that communal support, again, helps me feel grounded and empowered, especially when, I'm faced with challenges outside of certain spaces. My community for me is almost like a sense of safety. And again, it's also about kind of finding my voice and acting with purpose as well. So when I'm centered, I'm not just reacting, but I'm responding from a place of strength, which again empowers me to speak up, right, when something isn't right, or even, you know what I mean, maybe if I feel like I might be the only Black person in a room. But again, it's about me using my voice and to speak, right? Because I know that there's other people, right, who are again coming after me, like Dr. Hamilton said as well. Right. So it's making room for the next generation to come in as well, and to let them know that, you know what I mean, they have a seat at the table as well, and their voice matters.
Thank you. Why don't we hear from Coretta and then Dr. Hamilton-Hinch, if you would follow her. Thank you.
Just to go back to universities and schools centering Black students in real and everyday ways, it would require Black history and excellence to be integrated into all subjects all year round, just like you said, and not just during Black History Month or Black Excellence Day. It would require also teachers to adopt culturally responsive teaching methods that acknowledge value the diverse backgrounds and experiences of their students. It would require that representation from teachers, staff, faculty, especially in leadership positions. And of course, it requires the support of our student support workers. We all know how important our African Nova Scotian student support workers and Black advisors are in universities for our Black students. So it would require campuses and students to have dedicated and intentional spaces for our Black students that support them in ways that they need to be supported, as well as community engagement. I find that to be very important when it comes to connecting the school with the community, and especially centering our Black students and building those collaborative relationships, which would include continuing to partner with Black communities or organizations to support our students and expose them to opportunity. But when it comes to our Africentric spaces and being a student in those Africentric spaces, I say it all the time, it's a breath of fresh air. My cohort knows is my favorite line. It's a space where we can really truly just be our authentic self, without feeling a need to code switch or act any certain type of way. The curriculum reflects our history, our culture, and our experiences, which makes learning, of course, more engaging and relevant. Being in Afrocentric spaces, there's this feeling of community where you support each other and you share your cultural pride. It's very different from other learning environments. In Eurocentric spaces, we often feel like outsiders and forced to conform to a very structured, rigid, narrow worldview that marginalizes our voices and experiences. But Africentric spaces, we're empowered to be ourselves, embrace our cultural heritage, and just contribute with our unique perspectives. I'm extremely blessed to be a part of an Africentric cohort. And I'm confident due to our learning in an Africentric space that as educators, we will have an extremely positive impact on our classrooms here in HRM.
Yeah, I love hearing both what Summer and Coretta are sharing and reflecting back on my own education. And I'm really excited for what's going to be brought into the classroom by the two of you. And the importance when I think about centering spaces and centering myself as a Black person and being able to be in spaces that reflect me and that bring that Afrocentricity to it. It's not just about who's in front of me, it's also about the classroom. What can that environment look like? And I appreciate the Afrocentric cohort that has taken place at Auburn and has spilled over into Woodlawn and to Citadel High. And the fact that students have that opportunity to celebrate who they are as students of African descent and to do it unapologetically and to allow their Black brilliance to come through. And that being able to spill over to post-secondary is empowering. And seeing that in the education cohort that you're in, seeing it in the Afrocentric cohort and social work that's happening right now at Tallahassee. Haven't witnessed it in the master's program at the Mount when there's an Afrocentric cohort in master's education. And the misconception when we have these cohorts of seeing us as segregating ourselves as Black people, as opposed to seeing it uplift ourselves as Black people, of seeing the resilience and the strength. And as you talked about, Coretta, not cold switching, which a lot of us have to do on a daily basis, and how much relief it is when you walk into a space and you can cry if you want to because your day didn't go well or someone in your community was impacted in a different way. And you don't have to explain that. And you can cry silently and people understand those tears and they're with you. And you don't have to have an intimate relationship. Like there's nothing worse when something happens in our community and someone says, "Did you know them?" And it's like, no, I'm still impacted by my community. And so when I think about being in Afrocentric spaces, it's not sometimes being having to speak, that being able to make that eye contact with a brother or sister and no words have to be exchanged. And already they're saying, "I got you." And I think in post-secondary institutions and in positions of senior leadership, it's amazing when I can look across the table and see someone else who looks like me and be able to have that same quiet conversation with someone not knowing that we're having this conversation. And I appreciate being able to walk into a space and change it as a person of Africans and as African Nova Scotian. And that forces us to make those spaces more accountable to who we are as Black people. Because I think as we move into spaces and as we bring and center our experience as people of African descent, people are more careful of how they speak, of what they say, because of the confidence that we're exuding as people of African descent. And I think for me in the academy, also in post-secondary, having a space where there's a sisterhood and a brotherhood, where you have at least one other person that you can talk to and exchange ideas with and feel validated. And as you're talking about having Black student advisors, having professors, at Dalhousie, we do use the term the aunties and uncles, because we don't have to be teaching in those classrooms where students are that are Black. If they know we're on campus and they have a problem, they're going to seek us out. And that's part of being a community outside of a community. And that's about centering our experiences as Black people. It's about bringing our spirituality into spaces and not making an excuse with that. And there's a difference between spirituality and being religious. And our people, we're spiritual people. And we need to remind people that we're spiritual people, that we're strong people, that we're resilient people. And so being able to celebrate that in post-secondary and in spaces that we're in is important. And seeing some of that transformation happen on the walls. Watching some of the images be taken down and changed that reflect us. Seeing different positions exist in post-secondary institutions, and when you're not just walking on campuses, and it's a sea of white. And that's been wonderful to watch that transition and that change. And having had the opportunity to take students to HBCUs, you sometimes wish that we could create that space here. And there's been this joke of creating an HBCU in Canada, where it becomes it wouldn't be historical, it becomes a Black post-secondary institution that folks could go to. I know that students would go because we're seeing the benefits of being in a cohorted program, the strength, the resilience, the pride, the reduction in stress that happens for students. And that is still true for those of us who are in the academy, those of us who are in senior leadership. We have Black faculty caucuses in the African Nova Scotian strategy. And those spaces those affinity groups are where some of us are able to find that sense of peace because of those affinity groups. Because it is hard, no matter your education level, to navigate white spaces and not always be harmed by those spaces. And so needing to have a place where you can heal, right? And I am thankful for being able to heal in my community. And although I don't live in my Black communities, I go into my Black communities to heal. And because that's what nurtured me, that's what protected me, and that's who has created me. And I think as African Nova Scotians, as Black people, for me, that's important in centering myself in my communities and keeping that connection. And that helps us to be able to do what we do on a daily basis.
Thank you all so much for responding so passionately to that question. Let me say to the audience, it's going to be your turn to ask questions, so you can get those ready to pop into the chat. I'm going to ask one more question. As I've heard you talk about, as each of you talked about that whole notion of centering ourselves, I kept hearing this collectivism, community, the power of community, communal support, affirming, and how that leads to empowerment, how those intentional spaces, and that leads to this whole area of work that Patricia Hill Collins calls intellectual activism. Hill Collins coined the term intellectual activism to describe the many ways scholars use the power of their ideas in service of social justice. And she reminds us that scholarship should not only interpret the world, but also work to transform it. Dr. Hamilton-Hinch, your research deeply embodies this ethos. You have consistently used your scholarship to challenge dominant narratives, to center African worldviews, and to advance Africentricity in academic spaces. So my question to you would be, can you speak a bit about your journey as an intellectual activist in academia? And specifically, how have you used Africentricity as a framework for resistance and for transformation?
Yeah, thank you. When I think about my journey and using Africentricity as my framework and as resistance, not many students realize that when you're an undergraduate student, you can do independent studies. And as a graduate student, you can do independent studies. And so because I didn't see myself reflected in the curriculum that was being taught in both undergraduate and graduate, and then even within my PhD, I made sure to do independent studies. And so as in post-secondary, I started early changing curriculum and changing what's being taught in the classroom. And I would do courses that centered on the lived experience of Black people, and then would find someone to help supervise my independent studies so that I could learn something about who I was. And then I could share that with my colleagues and with my professors about what it meant to be a person of African descent, navigating whatever discipline I was in. And at that time, I was in the School of Health and Human Performance, which includes our health promotion, kinesiology, recreation management, therapeutic recreation. So as an undergraduate student, I did courses that talked about, some of our Black sport leagues, that talked about some of the traditions of our Black women, that eventually became money makers for other folks, such as berry picking or wreath making. And that history isn't in our textbooks. And so very early, I started trying to change and infiltrate the curriculum that's happening at post-secondary institutions. And then I would connect myself to research that was being done. And I remember a call out for the research that was happening for racism as violence. And that research spoke to me, and that was being led by Senator Thomas Bernard. It was a national research. And it was the first time for me that nationally people were going to talk about the impact of racism and seeing racism as violence. So throughout our lives, we know it was violent for us as Black people. And watching how that research project was developed, how it was being led and supported by everyday people in the community that didn't have this thing called formal education, but were committed to coming and having focus groups and conversations and talking about their pain and wanting to see a change in every aspect of health and every aspect of their lives. And it said to me, we can't sit here silent, those of us who have the education and able to make that change and not do something about it. So I used that project for my PhD and talked to women. And then when I moved into the academy as a professor, there was so little curriculum that reflected people of African descent. And most of the courses that we have are not mandatory. And that's also very frustrating, it's particularly in the Faculty of Health. And I'm glad to see other courses become mandatory. And I often will say to my colleagues in the Faculty of Health is that people can't pick who they're going to be taken care of. And that we can no longer sit by and watch harm be done to members of our community. And so it's important to have courses that center the lived experience of Black people. And so using Africentricity and using my framework, I began to develop courses called Centering Black Health. And it started out as an interprofessional IPHE where people could sign up and take it. And now it's a course that's built into the Faculty of Health and is connected to the Black African Diaspora Studies. And it's not a course that just Black students take. It was empowering for the first time we offered it, and was a majority of Black student class. And they said for them, it was the first time that they were the majority of students in a class, and how that felt liberating for them to be able to talk and share their experience. And then it's been integrated into other curriculums such as physiotherapy, OT, pharmacy. And watching students who are of European descent recognize how they have normalized whiteness and how they never thought about the impact of the curriculum or their actions on people of African descent. And that scares me. We're talking about 2025, where students who are soon to be health professionals have not had a course that talked about working with diverse and more specifically African, Nova Scotian, and Black patients or clients. So I'm appreciative of what's happening in the School of Social Work and some of the mandatory courses there. I'm appreciative of the education cohort, But having one course is not enough. Students cannot leave post-secondary without having an elective in a language. They can't leave post-secondary without having an English or a writing course. They should not be able to leave post-secondary without having a course that speaks about the history and experience of people of African descent, that centers the experience of African Nova Scotians. Because no matter what profession you're going into, you're going to encounter some of us. You're going to encounter people of African descent. You're going to encounter African Nova Scotians. So I continue to push with other colleagues at Dalhousie. We have an amazing African Nova Scotian strategy that's led by Professor Michelle Williams and Quinta Adams, where we continue to push the history and knowledge of African Nova Scotians. We have the Black Faculty Staff Caucus that's led by Dominique and Dr. Terry Lewis and a number of others who push the experience of our Black faculty and staff on this campus. We have implemented a number of positions that focus on EDIA, and we can't take our foot off the gas because we need to have these courses in medicine, in dentistry, in social work, in management, in science, because we are the scientists, we are the orators, we are the healers. And we need to keep pushing for those curriculum changes. It's great to see the Black African diaspora major that happens at Dalhousie University, which does exactly that, talks about the history from the beginning to the end of people of African descent. And we need to continue to create and develop these courses. And there's no excuse. You know, we want these courses where possible to be taught by as many Black professors as they can be. But so long as the material is accurate and people are committed to teaching these subjects, it can be people who aren't of African descent and invite us in as guest speakers or as lecturers. So there can't be the excuse there's not enough professors to do it. There's enough literature, there's enough research that we can create the curriculum and make meaningful changes. And we don't have to wait until someone tells us. I didn't wait until somebody said, can you create a course on centering Black health? I created the course and I said, I want to teach this course and I need to find a way to get it embedded. And I didn't sit back and say yes or no. There's a gap, we need to fill that gap. And I'm thankful for the leadership at Dalhousie and for my dean and my director who gave me that freedom to do that. But that's because I stand on the shoulders of those who come before me, and I've experienced the harm of what it was like to not be included in the curriculum. And as we say, when we know better, we do better. And I have a responsibility because of those who have opened doors for me to open doors for others. And I know it's going to be challenging to break through that concrete ceiling, but we have those who have the pickaxe out, that includes Senator Bernard, that's chipping at it and chipping at it and chipping at it. And we're going to get there. But we need to continue to push ourselves into leadership positions. We need to get involved in all levels of education and government, as I've been told, and be those change makers, not for tomorrow, but for today. And none of us are too young, and you don't need that PhD, that MA, that BEd, that undergraduate degree to make that difference. And I have recognized that through my involvement in grassroots research. And it's the grassroots, it's our community members who continue to push and advocate for the change. And I'm thankful for that.
That's really interesting to hear you talk about the journey of intellectual activism and changing, not just changing curricula, but also changing how the content is taught, but also opening those doors in terms of creating more diversity in terms of who are the teachers. So I'd like to ask Coretta first and then Summer, when you think about intellectual activism, and I want you to focus on prior to starting the Africentric BEd cohort, because we know that's different and you already have talked about it. So in your academic pursuits prior to going into the cohort, did you have any access to content that reflected your reality as students of African Nova Scotian ancestry? Did you see that intellectual activism in the institutions where you were?
I started with my undergrad at St. Mary's University, and I didn't start taking out social justice and community studies courses. I started out with criminology and a bunch of psychology courses, and no, there was no representation or any intellectual activism in anything to do, especially within the textbooks. Professors never like acknowledged it. It wasn't until I started taking my social justice courses where it was intentional. I wanted to be in spaces where I was learning about myself, learning about other marginalized groups. So it was up to me to make that decision and for me to make that choice to learn more about myself and my history. It wasn't something that was on the forefront or something that's advertised out there. So no, I had to really take it into my own hands and be the one to take charge of my education in that sense. You're muted.
I muted myself, sorry. So really you're highlighting the need for you to be in the driver's seat in terms of your own education and not having access to that until you sort of sought it out directly.
Exactly.
How about you, Summer?
Yeah, to kind of echo what Coretta said, I guess even kind of in elementary, like when Coretta spoke about having your student support worker, I remember having a student support worker who was very, like she made sure that we were seen and we were heard and we were valued. And she brought that, you know, that history of us being African Nova Scotians and those people who came before us and, you know, the Viola Desmonds and all of those people who, you know what I mean, took a stand or just, you know, fought for us. She made that very important and something to educate us about. And then I think Dr. Hamilton-Hinch, you kind of mentioned how there's not many courses that you can take that kind of center us as African Nova Scotians. And I can definitely speak to that I didn't, you know what I mean? I wasn't experienced to any courses where I knew my history. And it wasn't until high school where I got to choose the English, which was, I think it was African Canadian English. And again, it was a little bit about the history, but not so much about the African Nova Scotian history and who we are as people. But I will say, you know, I was kind of happy that I was at least able to kind of take that and kind of learn a little bit more there. As for university, I would say the same as Coretta, there wasn't really anything that I was taught that was kind of that intellectual activism. Again, that was something that I had to seek myself. So whether that was, you know, in community and, you know, putting myself out there or just kind of involving myself in different community aspects, even things, you know what I mean, like this. But again, it's kind of like, again, putting my foot in the forefront and opening those doors for myself. And I will say, I think from the communities that we all come from, I think community is a really big aspect in that. So I am grateful to have my community and to have those community leaders and those elders who open those doors. And again, to just, you know, like I said before, stepping out of your comfort zone, sometimes it can be, you know, a little bit awkward, but that's where, you know what I mean, for me, I gain a lot of wisdom and a lot of knowledge, and I'm able to take that wisdom and knowledge and educate not only myself, but again, the next generation that's coming behind me as well.
You took us all the way back to elementary school. And that's a wonderful reminder, though, of how important it is. And I think Dr. Hamilton-Hinch talked about daycare. So from cradle to grave, I say, you know, because we want to be thinking about lifelong learners. We're going to go now to our audience who've been listening intently, witnessing this conversation. And let's see what questions they have. I think, Magda, you are monitoring the chat for me.
Yes.
Because I quite haven't figured out quite how to do both. And so we'll have you read the questions. Is that okay?
Yes. So first we have a comment which says, wow, I wish that we could react in real time to what is being said. So powerful, Coretta. Next question is, how do we effectively and efficiently incorporate Afrocentricity as an inclusive model into a system that is by design oppositional to it? And then it goes on, moreover, how can we effectively implement Afrocentricity within this structure where our society is rapidly becoming diverse and pluralistic?
Okay, those are really good questions. Who'd like to jump into that?
I can provide one example that we've done in relation to medicine. And so I'm a part of the Black Health Education Collaborative, which is a national body of both researchers and MDs. And we know that our medical professionals are graduating and they have to write a medical exam. And the medical exam that they currently write does not reflect any questions relevant to people of African descent. And so often people will say, well, we can't ask the questions if we don't have the curriculum. So the Black Health Education Collaborative developed a curriculum. And the curriculum is being taught both at Dalhousie and at the Toronto Lama School of Medicine, and is being adopted by other med schools. Because of the fact that the Medical Council for Examination has now put in questions relevant to Black people because the curriculum is now developed. And so we have to continue to find ways to infiltrate curriculum, which then impacts how people are tested in their licensing bodies, and I'm speaking from a health perspective, where some questions began to be part of those who have to write licensure exams that talk about people of African descent or Black people. And we need to do, I was at a Black Health conference 2 weeks ago, and we talked about doing a health audit to find out where Black professionals are. We need to do a health audit to find out which health professions write licensure exams to make sure we're developing curriculum for those health professions, so that there can't be any reasons why they can't have them in the exams. And so using the med school as an example, people can't say it hasn't been done, because it has been done. And we have an online curriculum module that people can walk through. Similarly, in our school system, in our public school system, we have curriculum that has been written that reflect our African Nova Scotian African Canadian community. We need to stop making those courses electives, but make them mandatory. Because the African Canadian history is part of everybody's history, as we learn that. And there's no reason why you have to have 3 different histories in a public school system with students having an option of what they can take. So we need to lobby as educators and as community and start demanding that our history be taught, not secondary, but integrated. And so I do recognize that we're fighting against systems, but the systems and the people who are now in positions of power and influence has changed. A lot of us sitting on this call, our parents, at least for me, and I know for Senator Wanda Thomas Bernard, didn't have a high-level formal education. Not because they didn't want to, but because they didn't have the opportunities. We now have, en masse, a number of us that have a formal education. What are we going to do with that? Are we going to sit by and allow the systems to dictate how they're going to teach and what they're going to teach? Or are we going to collectively demand for change? And I say that because that's part of the activism that is in our DNA. It's part of the activism that's required of us from what our ancestors have gone through. And it's part of the activism that we have a responsibility to do because the sacrifices have been done before. So that's my contribution to that question.
Thank you for that. I'll just add, we're talking about problems that have multi-layers. And I think that the solutions also have to have multi-layers. So there's no sort of one answer to those questions. And I think the examples you've provided really highlight that. We'll go to the next question, please, Magda.
Next question. In what ways are we still lacking as a community when it comes to emancipating our minds? And at what areas should we focus a sense of urgency in order to have the most impact? And then there's several options: modern education, employment, health, historical knowledge, youth engagement, family planning, etc.
I'd like to hear from the young people on this one. I'd like the wisdom of our youth.
Can you repeat the question again? Sorry.
Absolutely. In what ways are we still lacking as a community when it comes to emancipating our minds? And in what area should we focus a sense of urgency on?
It's a really good question, actually. And I like questions like this because it makes myself kind of reflect a little bit.
Mhm.
And I would say kind of in the ways that maybe we're lacking is, I think sometimes it's our own personal development. I think sometimes we have to take accountability ourselves and our learning journeys. So for me, like I always try my best to, I always get out there with my community, but also to like stuff like this, right? I try to take myself out of my comfort zone, and just to develop my own learning when it comes to who I am, where I come from, just Afrocentricity in general. So I think it's a reflection about who you are as well, and kind of whatever experiences that are out there, or whatever you can kind of, you know what I mean, push yourself towards to get out of your comfort zone, to educate yourself a little bit more. I think that would be like a really great start, because again, that wisdom and that knowledge that you get from, your elders or your community members or whoever it is, right? You can take that back in your own, workplaces or your home life or wherever it is, and again, educate those people as well. So I think a lot of it starts with your own self and your own learning journey and that kind of professional development as well. So I definitely will say, like, if there's any professional development, any learning opportunities that, you know what I mean, you can engage in, do it. Again, they're great opportunities. You always learn, a lot, and it's great information that you can, again, take back with you, and to, again, just support yourself and yeah.
Any thoughts, Coretta?
I think Summer covered kind of everything on that one. I think, unfortunately, with a lot of just the way, like, community historically things were put into the education system too, it can be a little bit difficult to emancipate our mind in that sense. But other than that, just being strong as a community and make sure that you're using your voice when needed, it's definitely helpful and can be beneficial to moving forward as a community.
Thank you. One thing that I'll add here, we sometimes forget that we're still dealing with the everydayness of racism. We sometimes forget that racism is a form of violence. And then we forget that the racial violence brings trauma. And I think one of the spaces where I feel we're lacking is that we're not acknowledging the trauma of racism. And when we don't acknowledge the trauma of racism, sometimes we develop very unhealthy ways to deal with it. Hurt people hurt people. And so I believe that one of the places that we're lacking is that we're not creating spaces for people to heal. We're not putting enough emphasis, I don't think, on wellness and racial wellness and what we need to do to mitigate the harm caused by the trauma of racism and the everydayness of racism. So if I was encouraging anything, I would be encouraging people to, be on the journey. Do that work, because I think it's important. We'll go to the next question, Magda, please.
This one is directed at both Coretta and Summer. They mentioned their roles as student support workers. Can they share what they think is working well with the program? Are there any recommendations they have for HREC to make the African Nova Scotian Student Support Worker Program more impactful for Black learners?
Oh, that's a great question.
It is a good question. I can start for that. This was my first year working as a student support worker in a term position. It was very eye-opening. Of course, wasn't expecting a lot of the things that not only the students have to deal with, but also student support workers. Racism is still very prevalent in the schools, which was a shock to me as well. So not only do I recommend there needs to be more support for students when it comes to having any forms of discrimination or racism towards them, but also for the student support workers, because a lot of people have these jobs, and although they might not have a BED or they may not have a BA or training or have worked with children before, there just needs to be more support in the sense that like professional development, training, it's all needed to make sure that students are receiving the proper amount of support that they deserve. It feels like borderline counseling. So just making sure that student support workers have just as much support as the students do as well, I think would be very important. Other than that, I think that's mainly it that I can touch on for that. It was my first year in the role, so it was a lot of learning experience, many things that I would do different next year if possible. But other than that, we know how impactful they are in the schools. They're very having those positive relationships with students. It's very impactful. You can see the change from the beginning of the year to the end. So we know how impactful it is for student support workers. So just like I said, them having that same support would be my biggest suggestion or recommendation.
And I'll just add to that. I definitely echo what Coretta says, for sure. On the other side of that, I've been in the role for 4 years, and I will be returning back in September as well. And I work at a high school and also in elementary. So I have the little ones, and I also have the older kids. And for me, just my own journey. Again, we know how important we are in the schools and in those relationships with our students. But for me, it's about that validation. And I find as student support workers, we don't really get enough validation. We aren't really seen as professionals. So I just find our role, or the way I guess teachers or faculty see our role, isn't as important. So I think there needs to be more importance and emphasis on our roles. And I think too, I find a lot of teachers come to me, during February. And it's great. But I think, teachers need to reach out more and be more active all year round, right? Not just coming to us during February. We need to, again, build back that connection in that community within the school, and not just seen as, oh, if you're struggling, then you need to go see your student support worker, or, this is kind of the role of your student support worker. Again, we definitely play big roles. And I think our faculty and our teachers and just the school community really need to see that and use us as tools. And yeah, that's kind of where I would go with that. And just, again, like Coretta said, just more support for us as well. Sometimes we're one student support worker with, a few hundred kids, right? Which can be a lot at times. So we need as much support as we give our students as well. And again, that professional development, that training, all of those things are important. And I think a lot of our teachers also need that professional development as well, again, to handle those situations. Because I find too, a lot of, when it comes to those racial situations that happen in school, right, we're always the go-to. Right. Whereas it's, teachers also need to get comfortable with being, like I said, get comfortable with being uncomfortable, right? Have those uncomfortable conversations, right? Because again, what's right and you know what's wrong, instead of just, okay, well, I'll go to the student support worker and they can deal with this situation. So again, I think it's about building their confidence too, because I know a lot of teachers, aren't confident with talking about race, right? So again, just having that professional development, those training, and just validating us more as student support workers in our roles. I think that would be great. Yeah.
That's awesome. Thank you. I think we can take one more question, Magda.
Okay. Okay. When I imagine an emancipated mind, I think about Black folks creating, promoting, and occupying spaces that are conducive to us showing up as our authentic selves, and to challenge the ones that require us to translate our souls and to do this as a collective. My question to the panel is, how do we move towards more collaborative approaches to doing what is necessary to emancipate our collective mind?
Let's have Dr. Hamilton-Hinch put her voice to this question. Thank you.
I think you're seeing that. even in terms of what Summer and Greta talked about in terms of the different cohorts that are taking place, and the different cohorts that have taken place, that there is this collective unification of looking at and thinking about freeing our minds and what that means collectively. And then I go back to some of the town halls and family meetings we used to have online. That is missed, and it was open to anyone to join. And we would have great discussions about racism, about COVID-19, about what's Africentricity, and we don't have as many of those. So I think that having those spaces and those opportunities to collectively talk about these issues, the various conferences that we would go to, that would be all about and for Black people. Appreciating the different associations that exist, such as the Association of Black Social Workers, the Black Educators Association, our AUBA, being integrated in those spaces where collectively we have that opportunity to educate and support and emancipate our minds. Because remember, some of our first teachers, those of us in our Black communities, was our churches, where they talked about racism, where they talked about what it meant to be a Black person, to navigate this place. And so I think if we can put ourselves in collective spaces and have these questions and have discussions about what it means to be a person of African descent, to emancipate our mind from colonization, to emancipate our minds from things that were wrong, that we were once told about ourselves, to educate ourselves about the fact that we are kings and queens, that we are Black brilliance, that we are capable, and that we continue to pour that into each other, can really fight against what we're being told differently from society. And that's why I think the education cohort is so important, because our children need to hear that message early so it can carry them through. It's important to have our cohort in social work because of the harm and the trauma that many of our families have experienced, and being able to have someone who can talk through that harm and trauma is important. And I think that these types of cohorts, these types of conversations can collectively emancipate our minds. So I appreciate that conversation. We need to be intentional in putting ourselves in spaces where we're validated, supported, and so that even some of that healing that Senator Bernard talked about can begin. Because we do need to think back about post-traumatic slave syndrome and how that has impacted us, and some of the healing that needs to take place. And some of us do need to re-educate ourselves on who we are as Black people, as people of African descent, as African Nova Scotians.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, audience, for your questions. I want to wrap up with a poem that I have written that I call Emancipate Your Mind. Emancipate your mind, stand tall, unshaken, from the echoes of Preston to Parliament's chambers. They told us to wait, to stay in our place, but our roots run deep. We were never meant to be erased. Viola sat so justice could rise. A ticket denied became a nation's disgrace. She set fire to silence, igniting a truth that still burns brightly across this place. Carrie wrote when others stayed silent, her pen a weapon, her paper a battleground. The Black press spoke volumes with every stroke. She gave voice to the hushed. She made racial consciousness a collective mission. Rocky walked into rooms marked whites only. He walked into institutions that denote exclusion. He didn't wait for permission. He changed the locks and led the revolution because resistance had taken root. Senator Oliver rose with the force of the law, his voice strong and deliberate, his purpose bold and considerate. He shook the foundation of unjust systems, a beacon for truth across the nation. Senator Ruck shattered the ceilings above, navigated halls where we were once barred. He pushed us beyond cleaning basements, and created pathways to change for generations that followed. Our ancestors stood when it meant risking all. They whispered legacy into our bones. They spoke in stories, in music, in art, in prayer, in revolution. Survive, thrive, rise. You belong. You've always belonged. So today I rise, rooted here, bold and intentional, unbending, brave, on the shoulders of giants who led the way. I lift my voice, not for me alone, but for every soul waiting to see a better day. Together we rise, linked by ancestry, by determination, by commitment to change. We pick up the torch from those who made a way out of no way, and we prepare to pass the torch to those still fighting, to still forging a path forward. They do not accept no. We are the dream, the fight, the critical hope, made visible, made real. Together we rise because it is time to unlearn limits, to dismantle doubt, time to redraw the lines of power and possibility, time to reclaim, to redefine, to reimagine. Together we rise to emancipate our minds. Thank you all. Thank you all, Dr. Hamilton-Hinch, Summer, and Coretta. Thank you for just engaging in such an inspiring conversation today. We have talked about transforming the academy. And from what I've heard today, I feel confident in saying that that's happening, and it's going to happen more and more. To everyone who's joined, join us for the next 3 weeks as well. As we lead up to Emancipation Day, let us make a commitment to engage in these conversations. Invite others to participate in these conversations. Let's collectively emancipate our minds. Next week, we'll be joined by Dr. Késa Munroe-Anderson and some young people. I don't have the names of the young people, but we'll be sure to post those. The focus is She Who Learns Teaches, Black feminist mentorship in academia. So we'll continue the conversation, and together we will emancipate our minds. Thanks, everyone. Could the speakers stay on the line, please? And thank you to DBDLI and the full team for all of your work today in making this happen. I see lots of things being put in the chat, but I'm not